Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones you can see, and sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. In the cold village of Stenlund, Runa was sold for 10 copper coins to a giant Viking farmer named Hakon. She prepared herself for the worst night of her life. But Hakon surprised everyone. He didn't touch her or make demands. Instead, he cooked her a warm meal, gave her clean blankets by the fire, and said something that changed everything. "You are not mine, but you are safe here." For the first time in years, Runa slept without fear. What simple act of kindness would turn this broken woman's life around completely? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after that first night brought with it the crisp bite of autumn air and the distant sound of axes splitting wood. Stenlund was a village that had forgotten how to dream, where survival meant keeping your head down and your expectations lower. Nestled between rolling hills that turned golden in summer and white as bone in winter, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and most of that business was tragic. Hakon Eriksson had chosen this isolation deliberately. At 42, he carried himself with the measured gait of a man who had seen too much and learned to move carefully through the world. His farmstead sat on the village's eastern edge, close enough to trade, but far enough to avoid the endless chatter that filled the market square each morning. The house itself was modest, stone walls thick enough to keep out the worst of winter's fury, a roof of layered sod that stayed green even when snow covered everything else, and windows small enough to conserve heat but large enough to let in hope. His hands, permanently stained with soil and calloused from years of work, told the story of his transformation. These were no longer the hands that had gripped a sword with deadly precision or hefted a tool shield against charging enemies. The worn leather gloves he pulled on each morning had become as much a part of him as his own skin, soft brown leather that had molded to his fingers over countless seasons, patched where the thumb had worn through, darkened with honest sweat and the oils of well-maintained tools. They were gentle hands now, patient hands, hands that coaxed life from reluctant earth and mended what others had broken. The village elder, Bjorn Ironside, had arrived just after sunrise that first morning, his weathered face creased with concern and curiosity. He'd known Hakon since the day the former warrior had appeared in Stenlund 7 years ago, asking only for land to farm and peace to forget. Bjorn respected men who kept their past buried, but this business with the woman had the entire village talking. "The girl seems quiet enough," Bjorn had said, settling his considerable bulk onto Hakon's doorstep while Runa remained inside. "But folk are wondering what you plan to do with her." Hakon had continued sharpening his plough blade, the rhythmic scraping of whetstone against metal filling the silence between them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of certainty that came from hard-won wisdom. "I plan to let her heal. Healing is expensive, Hakon. 10 copper coins don't buy you a lifetime of charity. They bought me the right to make my own choices." Bjorn had nodded slowly, understanding that some conversations were finished before they truly began. He'd known warriors before, men who had traded violence for peace and found the peace harder to master than the violence had ever been. If Hakon Eriksson wanted to shelter a broken woman, that was his right. The village would watch, judge, and eventually accept, as villages always did. Inside the house, Runa had awakened to sunlight streaming through those small windows and the unfamiliar sensation of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She clutched the bundle of heather she had carried from her previous life, purple flowers, now brittle and brown. Their sweet scent faded to something that reminded her of better days when such beauty seemed possible. The flowers were dying, just as she felt she had been dying. But Hakon had not asked her to throw them away. Instead, he had found a small clay pot for them, setting it on the wooden table, where morning light could reach it. "They're beautiful," he had said simply, and she had almost wept at the kindness in his voice. The days that followed established a rhythm neither had expected. Hakon rose before dawn, as farmers must, but he moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake. The woman who slept curled near the hearth like a wounded animal, finally safe enough to rest deeply. He would tend to his animals, first 3 goats, a handful of chickens, and an old draft horse named Thunder, who had earned his retirement through faithful service. Then came the endless tasks that farming demanded: mending fences, checking the root cellar, preparing for the harsh winter that was already sending scouts in the form of morning frost. Runa watched him work from the windows, fascinated by the care he took with everything he touched. His movements were deliberate, but never hurried, efficient, but never careless. When one of his chickens had developed a limp, she watched him examine the bird with the same gentle attention a healer might give a king. The worn leather gloves never left his hands during work, and she began to understand they were more than protection. They were a barrier between the man who had once dealt in death and the man who now nurtured life. She began to help in small ways. First, it was simply keeping the fire fed and water heated for when he returned from morning chores. Then, gradually, she found herself sweeping the floor, organizing the simple shelves that held his few possessions, and eventually preparing simple meals from the stores he kept in his well-stocked pantry. He never asked for these things, never expected them, and his genuine gratitude when he discovered her small contributions made her chest tight with an emotion she had almost forgotten. The village blacksmith, Eric the Red, became their first real test. He arrived one afternoon with a plough blade that needed repair, his massive frame filling Hakon's doorway, and his eyes immediately seeking out the woman everyone was talking about. Eric was a good man, but he was also a man of strong opinions and little patience for what he saw as foolishness. "So this is the one you bought," he said, his voice carrying across the room to where Runa sat, mending a tear in one of Hakon's work tunics. "She looks healthy enough. When's the wedding?" The question hung in the air like smoke from green wood. Runa's hands stilled on the needle, and she felt that old familiar tension creep up her spine, the readiness to run, to hide, to become invisible before someone decided she was more trouble than she was worth. But Hakon's response came without hesitation, his tone measured but firm. "There won't be a wedding, Eric. Runa is here because she needs a safe place to be, that's all." "That's all?" Eric's laugh was not unkind, but it carried the weight of a man who had lived long enough to be skeptical of noble gestures. "Hakon, you paid 10 coins for her. The whole village knows it. If you're not planning to marry her, what exactly are you planning?" Hakon set down the plough blade he had been examining and looked directly at his friend. "I'm planning to be the kind of man my mother raised me to be, the kind who helps when he can and asks nothing in return." "Your mother raised a warrior. My mother raised a son who knew the difference between strength and cruelty." The conversation ended there, but Runa understood something had shifted in the room. She had been defended not as property or potential bride, but as a person worthy of safety simply because she was human. The realization made her hands shake slightly as she resumed her mending. That evening, as they shared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and the last preserves from summer's bounty, Hakon spoke to her directly for the first time, about the arrangement that had brought her to his home. "I want you to know," he said, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of warm cider, "that you're free to leave whenever you choose. I won't chase you, won't claim ownership, won't demand payment for food and shelter. This is your choice to make." Runa looked up from her own cup, meeting his eyes for the first time since she had arrived. They were kind eyes, she realized. Tired, perhaps marked by experiences she couldn't imagine, but fundamentally kind. "Where would I go?" "Wherever you want. There are other villages, other places, where a woman can make a life for herself. I have some coins saved, enough to get you started somewhere else if that's what you prefer." The offer was genuine, she could see that, but the thought of leaving this warm house, this gentle man, this first taste of safety she had known in years, made her stomach clench with fear. "I would like to stay," she said quietly, "if you'll have me." "For as long as you like," he assured her. As autumn deepened into its final weeks, the village began to accept the strange arrangement at the Eriksson farm. Hakon continued his quiet life, tending his land and preparing for winter with the same methodical care he brought to everything. Runa grew stronger, both in body and spirit, finding purpose in the small tasks that made their shared life possible. The bundle of heather remained on the table, its flowers now completely dried, but somehow still. Beautiful, in their delicate fragility, a reminder of what had been lost and what might yet be saved. The gossiping tongues gradually found other subjects to discuss, though the occasional visitor still arrived with curiosity thinly disguised as neighborly concern. Old Helga, the village's self-appointed keeper of moral standards, appeared one crisp morning with a basket of apples and pointed questions about propriety. Young Leif, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, sought advice about courting from a man who had acquired a woman without the usual rituals of romance. To each visitor, Hakon gave the same patient explanations, his worn leather gloves steady as he continued whatever task occupied him, his voice never rising but never yielding ground. Runa was not his woman. She was not his servant. She was simply a person who needed time to heal, and he was providing that. Time, because he could. The truth was simpler than any of them imagined, and more radical than most could understand. Hakon Eriksson had learned to be gentle because he remembered too well what it meant to be otherwise. And Runa was learning to trust again because someone had finally shown her that trust could be offered without conditions, without price, without the inevitable demand for payment that had defined every relationship in her previous life. As the first real snow began to dust the hills around Stenlund, both understood that whatever was growing between them was as fragile and unexpected as new growth in unlikely soil. But it was growing nonetheless, nurtured by patience, watered by kindness, and protected by the simple revolutionary act of treating another human being as worthy of care for no reason other than their shared humanity. The man who came to Stenlund 3 weeks before the harvest festival carried winter in his eyes and violence in the set of his shoulders. Magnus Bloodaxe was not his birth name, but it was the name that mattered. Now, the name that made strong men step aside and sent mothers hurrying their children indoors when his shadow fell across their doorways. He arrived at sunset on a horse that had clearly been ridden hard, its flanks streaked with foam and its breath coming in sharp puffs in the cooling air. The animal itself told a story of wealth and conquest, a destrier built for war, with scars along its neck that spoke of battles survived and enemies trampled. Magnus himself was a man who commanded attention without seeking it, tall and broad, with the kind of presence that made rooms feel smaller simply by his entry. Hakon was mending a section of fence when the stranger rode past, heading toward the village center. Something about the man's bearing, the way he sat his horse, the casual confidence with which he surveyed the humble farmsteads, made old instincts stir in Hakon's chest. He had known men like this during his warrior years, men who took what they wanted and left destruction in their wake, because they could. In the house, Runa was grinding barley for the evening bread when she heard the hoofbeats slow, then stop. Through the small window she caught a glimpse of the rider, and her blood turned to ice water in her veins. She knew that profile, those shoulders, the way he held his head as if the world owed him tribute. Her hands began to shake so violently that she dropped the grinding stone, and the crash brought Hakon running from the yard. Runa! He found her backed against the wall, her face pale as new snow, her breathing quick and shallow. "What's wrong?" "Magnus," she whispered, and the name seemed to steal all the warmth from the room. "Magnus Bloodaxe, he's come for me." Hakon moved to the window, keeping himself between Runa and the glass. The rider had dismounted and was speaking with old Bjorn in the village square, his gestures casual, but his attention constantly scanning the surrounding buildings. Even from this distance, Hakon could see the weapons the man carried, not just the obvious sword at his hip, but the subtle knife sheaths, the way his cloak was cut to allow quick access to hidden steel. "Who is he to you?" Hakon asked, his voice carefully controlled. "My former master." The words came out broken, as if speaking them aloud might summon the man to their door. "He owned me before I was sold. I thought he was dead. I hoped he was dead." Hakon's jaw tightened as understanding dawned. The careful way Runa flinched from sudden movements, her startled awakening from nightmares she never discussed, the grateful tears when he had promised she was safe, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. "Tell me what happened between you." Runa slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees like a child seeking comfort. "I was barely 16 when my parents died in a raid. Magnus claimed me as part of the spoils. For 3 years I was his—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but the haunted look in her eyes completed the story. "How did you get free of him?" "There was a battle. A rival clan attacked his stronghold. I escaped during the fighting, ran for days until I collapsed. A traveling merchant found me, brought me to the village, where I was sold." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Magnus never forgets what belongs to him. If he's here, it's because he's been searching." Through the window, they could see the conversation in the square growing animated. Magnus's voice, though they couldn't make out words, carried the tone of a man accustomed to getting answers. Bjorn was gesturing toward the various farmsteads, clearly being pressed for information about the village's inhabitants. Hakon pulled on his worn leather gloves, the familiar gesture steadying his thoughts. 7 years of farming had not erased the tactical mind that had kept him alive through countless battles. "He doesn't know which house you're in yet," he said quietly, "but he will soon enough. This village keeps no secrets for long. I have to run." Runa started to rise, panic driving her movements. "If he finds me here, he'll kill you for harboring what he considers his property. I won't have your blood on my hands." "You're not running anywhere." Hakon's voice carried such quiet authority that Runa froze mid-motion. "And you're not his property. Not anymore. You don't understand what he's capable of." "I understand exactly what he's capable of." Hakon moved away from the window, beginning to gather. Certain items from around the room, a whetstone, oil for blade maintenance, leather strips for grip wrapping. "I also understand what I'm capable of." Runa watched him work with growing comprehension. The careful, gentle farmer was methodically transforming himself into something else, something that moved with predatory efficiency and saw angles and advantages where others saw only furniture and walls. "You were more than just a warrior, weren't you?" "I was what I needed to be to survive." Hakon paused in his preparations to look at her directly. "Just as you were what you needed to be to survive. But that time is over for both of us." The knock on their door came an hour later, polite but insistent. Magnus had clearly spoken to enough people to narrow his search considerably. When Hakon answered, he found not just Magnus, but also Eric the blacksmith and 2 other village men, witnesses to whatever conversation was about to unfold. Magnus smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered features into something almost handsome. It was a practiced charm, the kind that had likely smoothed his way through countless negotiations and conquests. "Good evening, friend. I'm looking for something that belongs to me," a woman, about 25 years old, dark hair, small scar above her left eyebrow. "I have it on good authority she might have found shelter in your household." "You have interesting information sources," Hakon replied, making no move to step aside or invite the man in. "But I'm afraid I can't help you." "Can't? Or won't?" The smile remained, but something cold flickered in Magnus's eyes. "The woman in question is stolen property, taken from my lands during a raid 3 years ago. I've traveled a long way to reclaim what's mine." "Nothing in this house was stolen," Hakon said. Everything here was paid for, honestly. Magnus laughed, a sound like steel scraping stone. Paid for? You mean the copper coins? My dear fellow, you can't purchase what already belongs to another man. The transaction was invalid from the start. Behind Hakon, Runa appeared in the doorway. Her face was pale but determined, her chin raised with a dignity that seemed to surprise Magnus. In her hands she clutched the dried bundle of heather, its brittle stems providing some small anchor of courage. "Hello, Magnus," she said, her voice steadier than anyone might have expected. "Still taking things that don't belong to you, I see." The false charm dropped from Magnus's expression like a discarded mask. "There's my little songbird. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused me? How many resources I've spent tracking you? Down? I imagine it's been quite the hardship," Runa replied. "Almost as much of a hardship as the 3 years I spent as your captive." "Captive?" Magnus turned to the watching villagers, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man explaining simple facts to children. "Gentlemen, this woman was legally bound to my household. Her parents owed a debt that their deaths left unpaid. She was working off that obligation when she fled, stealing not only herself but also valuable items from my home." "What valuable items?" Hakon asked. Magnus hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for a man trained to read enemies to notice. "Personal effects, jewelry, items of sentimental value." "I took nothing but the clothes on my back," Runa said firmly. "Nothing that hadn't been given to me. The word of a runaway slave against mine." Magnus spread his hands to the assembled villagers. "Come now, surely you can see the absurdity of that." But Eric the blacksmith was frowning, his own sense of justice clearly troubled by the exchange. "If the woman was legally bound to you, where are your documents? Any man with a legitimate claim carries proof." The question caught Magnus off guard, and for a moment his mask slipped entirely, revealing something far more dangerous underneath. "My proof is my word and my presence. In my lands, that's more than sufficient." "These aren't your lands," Hakon said quietly. "And here, a man's word means only as much as his honor will support." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threat. Magnus stepped closer to Hakon, close enough that the watching villagers could see the tension crackling between the two men like heat lightning before a storm. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," Magnus said, his voice carrying undertones that made the village men shift uncomfortably. "Man to man, warrior to warrior. I suspect you and I understand each other better than these simple folk might appreciate." Hakon nodded slowly. "Perhaps we should." He turned to Runa, his expression gentle, but his meaning clear. "Go inside, heat water for tea. We'll be talking for a while." As Runa reluctantly retreated into the house, still clutching her bundle of heather like a talisman, both men understood that the careful peace Hakon had built around his new life was about to be tested in ways that would determine not just Runa's future, but the very man he had chosen to become. The conversation between Hakon and Magnus took place behind the woodshed, away from curious eyes, but within earshot of anyone who cared to listen carefully. Eric lingered near the fence, ostensibly checking the gate latch while clearly monitoring the situation. The other villagers had drifted back toward their homes, but Hakon noticed several windows where lamplight suggested people were staying awake longer than usual. Magnus studied Hakon with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up potential. "Pray, you're not what I expected," he said finally. "The villagers described a simple farmer, but you move like a man who's seen real war." "I've seen enough," Hakon replied, his worn leather gloves flexed as he crossed his arms. "More than enough." "Good. Then you understand what I'm offering." Magnus's tone shifted to something almost reasonable, one professional to another. "I'm not an unreasonable man, despite what the woman might have told you. I'm willing to compensate you for your trouble, the 10 coins you paid, plus another 10 for your inconvenience. 20 coins for a woman. You've known less than a month. That's generous by any standard. And if I refuse? Magnus smiled, and this time the expression held genuine warmth, the kind a wolf might show when contemplating a particularly tender lamb. Why would you refuse? You seem like an intelligent man. You've built a good life here, a peaceful life. Why risk all of that for someone who was never really yours to begin with? Hakon was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sound of autumn wind moving through the bare branches overhead. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Tell me about this debt her parents supposedly owed. Grain loans during a hard winter, Magnus said without hesitation. They borrowed heavily to feed their family and couldn't repay when harvest came. It's a common enough story. And you happen to be the one lending grain to struggling farmers. I help people when I can. Magnus spread his hands in a gesture of modest virtue. When they can't repay in coin, sometimes we work out other arrangements. How convenient. Hakon's tone remained neutral, but something cold flickered in his eyes. And I suppose you have documentation of this. Loan? Records of the original agreement? Magnus's smile faltered slightly. Documentation? These were simple people, farmer. They couldn't read or write. Everything was done on trust and honor. Your word against theirs, and they're conveniently dead to contradict you. I don't care for your more. Implication. The reasonable mask was beginning to slip, revealing glimpses of the predator underneath. I've been more than patient with this situation, but my patience has limits. Inside the house, Runa was indeed heating water for tea, but her hands shook so badly she could barely manage the simple task. Through the walls, she could hear the murmur of male voices, but not the words themselves. The not knowing was almost worse than whatever threats Magnus might be making. She found herself studying the bundle of heather on the table, its dried flowers now brown and fragile, but somehow still beautiful in their delicate persistence. 3 weeks ago, these flowers had represented the last remnant of her old life, something to clutch while everything familiar crumbled away. Now they seemed like something else, a bridge between who she had been and who she might become. The sound of approaching footsteps made her heart race, but it was only Hakon who entered, his expression thoughtful but not defeated. Magnus remained outside, she realized, which seemed encouraging. What did he say? She asked. He offered to buy you back for 20 coins. Hakon moved to the fire, warming his hands while he gathered his thoughts. And when I asked for proof of this supposed debt your parents owed, his story became considerably less convincing. You don't believe him? I've heard too many lies in my lifetime to be fooled by bad ones. Hakon turned to face her directly. But believing him isn't the real problem. The real problem is that he's not going to accept no for an answer. Runa sank into the wooden chair by the table, her fingers unconsciously reaching for the dried heather. He's not just here for me. Magnus doesn't travel this far for one escaped woman. No matter what he claims, there's something else he wants. What do you mean? I've seen him work before. He never does anything for just one reason. Runa's voice took on the flat tone of someone recounting facts too painful for emotion. When he claimed me, it wasn't really about my parents' debt. It was because my father had been asking questions about missing livestock, getting close to discovering that Magnus was the one behind the raids that had been plaguing our area. Hakon's expression sharpened. You think he's been watching this village for reasons that have nothing to do with you? I think my being here gives him an excuse to be here. But once he's established a presence, once people accept his authority to reclaim his property, what's to stop him from finding other debts, other claims, other reasons to extend his stay? The implications of her words settled, between them like smoke from a poorly banked fire. A man like Magnus Bloodaxe didn't travel to remote villages for small prizes. If he was here, it was because Stenlund offered something valuable enough to justify the journey, something that Runa's presence merely provided a convenient excuse to. Investigate. Has he been asking questions about anything else? Hakon asked. Talking to people about more than just you? I don't know, but tomorrow is market day. If he's planning to learn about this place, that's when he'll do it. They sat in contemplative silence, the weight of unspoken understanding heavy between them. Outside, they could hear Magnus mounting his horse, the creak of leather and jingle of harness, suggesting he was finally departing for the evening. But his leaving felt more like a tactical withdrawal than a retreat. There's something else, Runa said quietly. Something I should have told you earlier. Hakon waited, his patience as steady as winter frost. When I escaped from Magnus's stronghold, I overheard him talking with his lieutenants. They were planning something big, something that would require multiple bases of operation. He was looking for villages like this one, remote enough to avoid attention, but prosperous enough to be worth controlling. Controlling how? Protection schemes, false debts, manufactured conflicts that only he could resolve. Runa met his eyes, her expression grave. He doesn't just take people, Hakon. He takes entire communities, slowly and carefully, until everyone becomes dependent on him for their safety and livelihood. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, while both considered the implications of this revelation. What had seemed like a personal crisis, one man seeking to reclaim what he considered his property, was revealing itself as something far more dangerous. Tomorrow, Hakon said finally, we'll need to warn the village elders. They need to understand what kind of man they're dealing with. And if they don't believe us? Hakon's worn leather gloves creaked softly as he flexed his hands, old instincts stirring despite his best efforts to keep them buried. Then we'll have to find another way to protect what matters. As they prepared for sleep that night, Runa by the hearth, Hakon in his simple bed across the room, both understood that their quiet life was entering a new phase. The bundle of heather on the table seemed somehow more fragile in the lamplight, a reminder that beautiful things could survive even when everything around them was dying, but only if someone was willing to tend them carefully. Market day in Stenlund arrived with the kind of crisp morning that promised either celebration or catastrophe, depending on who was asking the question. Magnus had spent the night at the village's only inn, a generous term for the converted barn where travellers could rent floor space and watered ale, and emerged at sunrise, looking remarkably well rested for a man sleeping on straw. Hakon arrived at the market square early, his cart loaded with the late autumn produce that would help carry his neighbours through the coming winter, turnips, preserved meat, and the hard cheese that had become his specialty. But his real purpose wasn't commerce. He positioned himself where he could observe Magnus's interactions with the villagers, and what he saw confirmed Runa's worst fears. Magnus moved through the crowd like a master craftsman at work, his approach different for each person he encountered. With the elderly, he was respectful and deferential, asking gentle questions about the village's history and challenges. With the merchants, he displayed a casual familiarity with trade routes and market conditions that suggested valuable connections. With the mothers, he was charming and concerned, inquiring about their children's welfare with the practiced ease of someone who understood exactly which emotional buttons to press. Old Helga was his first real success. The self-appointed keeper of village morality had always prided herself on knowing everyone's business, and Magnus played to that vanity with masterful skill. Such a well-ordered community, he said, accepting a cup of her famous honey mead while standing beside her stall. You can always tell when a place has proper leadership, someone who keeps watch over the moral character of the people. Helga preened under the compliment. It's not easy keeping folks on the righteous path, especially when some make questionable choices about the company they keep. Ah, you mean the situation with the farmer and his purchased woman? Magnus's tone carried just the right blend of understanding and gentle disapproval. I confess, I was shocked to learn of such arrangements in a community with your standards. Well, it's not exactly a normal marriage. if you understand my meaning." Helga lowered her voice conspiratorially. "No proper courtship, no blessing from the elders, no ceremony before God and witnesses. Just coins changing hands like she was livestock. How troubling for the children to witness such things," Magnus murmured. "They learn from what they see, don't they?" Within an hour, Magnus had extracted detailed information about every family in Stenlund, who owed money to whom, which marriages were struggling, whose crops had failed, and whose children showed promise or caused problems. He learned about the village's defenses, essentially none, and its wealth, modest, but accumulated over generations of careful saving. Most importantly, he identified the pressure points. Young Leif's father owed money to 3 different neighbors after a bad harvest. The miller's wife had been seen talking too often with the blacksmith when her husband was away on business. The elder's grandson had been caught stealing apples and was developing a reputation for petty theft. Each piece of information was a weapon Magnus could use when the time came to establish his authority over the community. Bjorn Ironside proved more resistant to Magnus's charm, but even the village elder wasn't immune to carefully crafted manipulation. Magnus approached him not as a supplicant seeking information, but as one leader consulting another about matters of mutual concern. "I've dealt with communities struggling under the burden of external threats," Magnus said as they shared bread beside Bjorn's trading stall. "Raiders, bandits, the usual collection of men who prefer taking to earning. It's remarkable how quickly a prosperous village like this can become a target." "We've had our share of troubles," Bjorn admitted. "Lost some livestock to thieves last spring, and there were reports of strange men camping in the hills during harvest time." "Concerning?" Magnus nodded gravely. "In my experience, such incidents are rarely random. They're usually scouts, testing a community's defenses before a larger group arrives." Bjorn's weathered face creased with worry. "You think they'll be back?" "Almost certainly, but there are ways to prepare, ways to discourage such predators before they become a real threat." Magnus paused, letting the implication settle. "Of course, it requires proper organization, proper leadership. Men who understand the nature of violence and how to respond to it effectively." From his position across the square, Hakon watched this conversation with growing alarm. He could see Magnus weaving his web with the skill of a master spider, creating problems that only he could solve, fears that only he could address. By the time Magnus was finished talking, Bjorn would be convinced that the village needed exactly the kind of protection that Magnus happened to provide. The morning grew worse when Magnus began demonstrating his capabilities. A dispute arose between 2 farmers over the ownership of a wandering goat, the kind of minor disagreement that normally would be settled by Bjorn with patient discussion and compromise. But Magnus stepped forward with the confident air of someone accustomed to solving problems. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the square, "surely this can be resolved quickly and fairly." Within minutes, Magnus had not only determined the goat's rightful owner, but had also negotiated a trade agreement between the 2 farmers that left both feeling satisfied and grateful. His method was efficient, decisive, and completely undermined Bjorn's traditional role as mediator and judge. "Remarkable," whispered Eric the blacksmith to Hakon. "The man settled in 5 minutes. What might have taken Bjorn half the day to work through." Hakon nodded grimly, understanding exactly what he was witnessing. Magnus wasn't just solving problems, he was demonstrating his value while simultaneously showing the inadequacy of existing leadership. It was a technique Hakon had seen used by ambitious men seeking to destabilize established order. The final blow came when Magnus offered to purchase goods from several merchants at prices significantly above what they might normally expect. Suddenly, the stranger wasn't just helpful and charismatic, he was profitable too. "I know." As the morning progressed, Hakon watched his neighbors' attitudes shift from cautious curiosity to growing appreciation for their unexpected visitor. Magnus was becoming not just tolerated but welcomed, not just accepted but valued. And with each small victory, each problem solved, and favor granted, his position in the village grew stronger. By midday, when Magnus approached Hakon's cart with the casual confidence of a man whose status was no longer in question, the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. "Fine turnips," Magnus said, examining the produce with the eye of someone who understood farming. "The soil here must be exceptional to produce such quality so late in the season." "Good enough," Hakon replied neutrally. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night," Magnus continued, his tone reasonable and almost friendly. "Perhaps I was too hasty in my approach. These village folk seem quite fond of you, and I respect that. What if we found a way to resolve this matter that benefits everyone involved?" Hakon set down the turnip he'd been arranging and looked directly at Magnus. "What kind of resolution did you have in mind?" Magnus smiled, and this time the expression was genuinely warm, the warmth of a man who had already won and could afford to be generous. "Why don't we discuss it this evening, perhaps over dinner? I'm sure Runa wouldn't mind cooking for her old friends." That evening, as autumn shadows lengthened across Hakon's farmstead, three figures sat around the simple wooden table that had become the center of an increasingly complex drama. Magnus had arrived precisely at sunset, bearing gifts that spoke to his growing confidence. Wine from distant lands, white bread made with flour finer than anything Stenlund's mill produced, and dried fruits that must have cost more than most villagers earned in a season. Runa had prepared the meal with hands that trembled only slightly, her composure maintained through sheer force of will. The bundle of heather remained on the table between them, its dried flowers, now seeming less like decoration and more like a silent witness to whatever was about to unfold. "You've done well for yourself here," Magnus said, surveying the modest but comfortable interior of Hakon's home. "A man could build a good life in a place like this, surrounded by honest folk who appreciate what he brings to their community." Hakon poured water for himself, while Magnus sampled the wine he'd brought. "It's been peaceful," he agreed carefully. "Peaceful," Magnus repeated, savoring the word along with his wine. "Such an undervalued quality these days. Do you know what I learned in the village today, Hakon? I learned that you're respected here, trusted. People speak of you as a man who keeps his word and helps when he can. Good neighbors make that easy." "Indeed they do." Magnus turned his attention to Runa, who had been quietly serving the meal while the men spoke. "And you, my dear, you look well. Better than I've seen you in years, if I'm being honest." Runa met his gaze steadily, though Hakon could see the effort it cost her. "I've had time to heal." "Healing is important," Magnus nodded gravely. "Sometimes we don't realize how much damage we've suffered until we have the luxury of safety to examine our wounds properly." The words were carefully chosen, carrying multiple meanings that hung in the air like smoke from green wood. Magnus was acknowledging Runa's recovery while simultaneously laying claim to understanding her condition better than anyone else present. He was also, Hakon realized, establishing himself as someone who cared about her welfare, a reasonable man whose only crime was caring too much about someone he'd lost. "Tell me about this debt," Hakon said abruptly, cutting through Magnus's careful positioning. "The one her parents supposedly owed." Magnus smiled, clearly prepared for this question. "Grain loans during the harsh winter 3 years ago. They borrowed heavily when their own stores ran short, promised to repay with interest after the next harvest." "How much grain?" 20 sacks of barley, 10 of oats. Enough to keep a family fed through the lean months. And the terms of repayment? Double the amount borrowed, paid in grain or its equivalent value in silver." Magnus's tone remained reasonable, as if he were discussing the weather. "Standard terms for such loans." Hakon did quick calculations in his head. The amount Magnus was describing would have been worth nearly a year's income for a typical farming family, far more than most would have borrowed for simple survival. That seems excessive for a family trying to avoid starvation. Desperate people make desperate bargains, Magnus said with a philosophical shrug. I tried to dissuade them, suggested they might find help elsewhere, but they insisted, said they had no other options. Runa's hand tightened around her cup until her knuckles showed white. That's not what happened, she said quietly. Memory can be a tricky thing, Magnus replied gently, especially when filtered through the perspective of a young woman who didn't fully understand the adult concerns her parents were managing. I understood perfectly well. Runa's voice gained strength as she spoke. My father never borrowed grain from you. He would never have agreed to terms like that, because he wasn't a fool. Magnus's expression remained patient, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Then how would you explain my records showing otherwise? What records? Hakon asked. Magnus reached into his traveling pack and withdrew a scroll of parchment, unrolling it carefully on the table. The document was written in a neat hand, detailed and official-looking, complete with what appeared to be 2 signatures at the bottom. The loan agreement, Magnus said simply, signed by both parties, witnessed by my steward. Hakon examined the parchment carefully. The handwriting was consistent throughout, the terms clearly stated, the signatures bold and seemingly genuine. To anyone unfamiliar with the people involved, it would appear to be legitimate documentation of exactly the transaction Magnus had described. This is fascinating, Hakon said slowly, especially considering that Runa's father couldn't write his own name. Magnus blinked, the first crack appearing in his careful composure. I beg your pardon? Runa's father was a good man, but he never learned letters. Her mother did all the reading and writing in their household. Hakon tapped the signature line with one finger. Yet this document bears what purports to be his mark, written in the same hand as the rest of the text. Runa leaned forward to examine the parchment more closely. That's not my father's mark anyway, she said with growing confidence. He always made a cross with a circle around it, because my mother taught him that combination when they were married. This is just a simple X. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Magnus stared at the document as if seeing it for the first time, his jaw working as he tried to formulate a response to this unexpected challenge. Documents can be forged, he said finally. Perhaps someone else created this false record to support a claim against me. Or perhaps, Hakon said quietly, someone created a false record to support a false claim. Magnus set down his wine cup with careful precision, and when he looked up, the mask of reasonable civility had begun to slip. You're calling me a liar. I'm pointing out inconsistencies in your story. And I suppose you think that gives you the right to keep what belongs to me. Hakon's worn leather gloves creaked softly as his hands clenched. Nothing here belongs to you. Everything here belongs to me. Magnus's voice rose for the first time, revealing the anger that had been carefully controlled beneath his diplomatic exterior. The woman, the debt she represents, and the obligation to honor legitimate contracts, all of it belongs to me by right of law and tradition. Whose law? Runa asked. Whose tradition? You're not in your territory now, Magnus. You're in ours. Magnus laughed, but the sound held no humor. Your territory? This collection of farmers and herders? You think your little village customs carry weight against a man who commands real power? I think, Hakon said, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a man whose body remembered violence even when his mind sought peace, that you've revealed quite enough about your true intentions for one evening. Magnus remained seated, but his posture shifted subtly, becoming more alert, more dangerous. Have I? And what intentions would those be? You're not here for Runa. You're here because this village represents an opportunity isolated enough to control, prosperous enough to exploit, and naive enough to welcome you with open arms. Hakon moved slightly, positioning himself between Magnus and the door, blocking the most direct escape route. The question is whether you're planning to leave peacefully or whether we need to have a different kind of conversation. Magnus smiled again, and this time the expression was genuinely predatory. "Oh, Hakon, I was hoping we could resolve this as civilized men. But if you insist on making this difficult, I suppose I'll have to show you exactly why that's not in anyone's best interest." Magnus rose from the table with the controlled movements of a predator who had decided stealth was no longer necessary. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the reasonable negotiator, the charming visitor, the concerned former master seeking what rightfully belonged to him. In his place stood something far more honest and infinitely more dangerous. "Let me tell you what's going to happen," Magnus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to address the village assembly. I'm going to explain how this community has been, harboring stolen property, how your so-called hospitality has made you accessories to theft, and how the only way to avoid serious consequences is to cooperate with the rightful authority." Hakon remained standing near the door, his worn leather gloves flexing as he assessed angles, distances, and possibilities. 7 years of peaceful farming hadn't dulled the tactical instincts that had kept him alive through countless battles. "And what authority would that be?" "Mine." Magnus's smile was cold as winter iron. "By tomorrow night, the village council will vote to place Stenlund under my protection. They'll beg for the privilege, actually, once they understand the alternatives. Protection from what? From the very real dangers that threaten isolated communities like this one." Magnus moved toward the window, gazing out at the peaceful farmstead as if already calculating its value. Bandits, raiders, the usual collection of desperate men who prey on defenseless settlements. It's remarkable how quickly such threats can materialize when a community lacks proper leadership. Runa had gone very still at the table, the bundle of heather clutched in her white-knuckled grip. She understood exactly what Magnus was describing, a protection scheme that would gradually transform Stenlund from an independent village into little more than a source of tribute and labor for his expanding network of controlled territories. "You're talking about extortion," Hakon said. "I'm talking about reality." Magnus turned back to face them, his expression matter of fact. "This village has prospered precisely because it's been lucky enough to avoid the attention of men like me. But that luck has run out, and now you have a choice. Accept protection willingly, or discover why. Other communities have found resistance to be both futile and expensive." "Other communities?" Magnus waved his hand dismissively. 3 villages north of here, 2 more to the east, all thriving under my guidance now, grateful for the stability my presence provides. Their people sleep safely at night because they understand the value of cooperation." The casual way he described his conquests sent a chill through the room. This wasn't the boasting of a man trying to intimidate opponents. It was the matter-of-fact recounting of a successful business model, tested and refined through multiple applications. "And what happens to people who refuse your protection?" Runa asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Magnus's gaze fixed on her with something approaching fondness. "Oh, my dear girl, you always did ask the most perceptive questions. What happens is that they discover how dangerous the world can be for those who stand alone against it. You create the danger you claim to protect against. I manage the danger that already exists," Magnus corrected. "Desperate men are going to prey on prosperous communities, regardless of my involvement. I simply provide a more civilized alternative to chaos." Hakon moved slightly closer to Magnus, his body language subtly shifting from defensive to potentially aggressive. "And Runa? Where does she fit into this civilized arrangement?" "Runa comes home where she belongs," Magnus said simply. "Her debt to me remains unpaid, and her presence in my household provides certain guarantees about this community's continued cooperation." "Over my dead body?" Magnus laughed, the sound genuinely amused. "Hakon, please, do you have any idea how many men have said those exact words to me? The phrase, has lost all meaning through repetition. Then let me be more specific. Hakon's voice dropped to the tone that had once made hardened warriors step back from him in caution. Runa stays here, under my protection, for as long as she chooses. Your protection scheme ends before it begins. And you, leave this village tomorrow morning with nothing but the horse you rode in on. And if I refuse, then we'll discover whether 7 years of farming has made me soft enough for you to handle. The challenge hung in the air between them like smoke from a blacksmith's forge. Magnus studied Hakon with new interest, clearly reassessing the man he'd initially dismissed as a simple farmer. The way Hakon carried himself, the careful positioning, the absolute confidence in his own capabilities, all of it suggested someone with far more dangerous experience than his current occupation implied. "You're not what you seem," Magnus said thoughtfully. "Neither are you. No, but I've never pretended otherwise." Magnus began moving around the room, ostensibly admiring Hakon's simple furnishings while actually mapping escape routes and potential weapons. "The difference between us, my friend, is that I've embraced what I am. You're still pretending to be something you're not." "What am I pretending to be?" "A peaceful man." Magnus picked up a simple clay bowl from a shelf, examining it as if it held the secrets of the universe. "But peace is a luxury that men like us can never truly afford. We can play at being farmers or merchants or whatever role suits our current needs, but violence calls to violence, Hakon. It always has, and it always will." Runa watched this exchange with growing alarm, understanding that both men were circling toward a confrontation that would shatter the careful life she and Hakon had built together. The bundle of heather in her hands felt increasingly fragile, a reminder of how easily beautiful things could be destroyed by forces beyond their control. "You don't know anything about what I want," Hakon said. "Don't I?" Magnus set down the biverent bowl with exaggerated care. "I know you've been playing house with a woman who isn't your wife, pretending that kindness and good intentions can somehow erase the blood you've shed and the lives you've taken. I know you've convinced yourself that becoming a farmer has somehow made you into a different person than the killer you were born to be. And I know," he continued, his voice taking on the hypnotic cadence of someone who understood exactly how to wield words as weapons, "that part of you has been waiting for someone like me to arrive. Part of you has been hoping for an excuse, to stop pretending, to remember what it feels like to be truly alive." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Hakon's jaw tightened as unwelcome truths forced their way into his consciousness. There had been moments, quiet evenings, when the simple rhythms of farm life felt almost suffocating. Mornings when he strapped on his worn leather gloves and wondered what it would feel like to reach for a sword instead of a plow handle. "You're wrong," he said, but the conviction in his voice had wavered slightly. Magnus smiled, sensing the crack in his opponent's armor. "Am I? Then prove it. Let me take what belongs to me and walk away. Show me that the farmer you've become is stronger than the warrior you used to be." The moment stretched between them like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point, filled with the weight of unspoken threats and half-revealed truths. Then Runa stood, her movement so sudden and decisive that both men turned toward her in surprise. The bundle of heather fell forgotten to the table as she walked to the wooden chest beneath the window, Hakon's personal storage that she had never opened, never even touched in all her weeks under his roof. "Runa," Hakon said, his voice carrying a warning he couldn't quite articulate. She lifted the heavy lid with both hands, revealing contents that made Magnus suck in a sharp breath of recognition and understanding. Nestled in oiled leather wrappings lay weapons that had clearly seen extensive use. A sword whose blade bore the subtle patterns of countless sharpenings, a battle-worn axe with a handle shaped by years of combat, daggers that gleamed with the kind of care that spoke to deadly familiarity with their purpose. But it was the shield that made Magnus step backward, involuntarily. Painted in faded colors that had once been vibrant, it bore a design that any warrior of their generation would recognize instantly, the raven and hammer symbol of Eric Bloodaxe's personal guard, the elite unit that had carved a legend across 3 kingdoms before disappearing into history 7 years ago. "Hakon the Raven," Magnus whispered, and his voice held something that might have been awe. "Hakon Ravenshield, the ghost of Ironwood. I should have known." Runa lifted the shield with reverent hands, its weight clearly familiar to her despite her slight frame. "I recognized the weapons the first day I was here," she said quietly. "My father told me stories about the man who broke the siege of Ironwood Keep, who held the bridge at Thornvale against 200 enemies, who disappeared after the great battle as if the earth had swallowed him whole." Hakon's worn leather gloves creaked as his hands slowly clenched into fists. The peaceful farmer's mask was cracking, revealing glimpses of something far more dangerous beneath. "You had no right to touch those things." "I had every right." Runa's voice carried 7 years of suppressed anger, not at him, but at the circumstances that had forced such a man to hide his true nature. "Do you know what it's been like, watching you pretend to be less than you are? Seeing you pull on those gloves every morning, like they could somehow erase who you were." Magnus was laughing now, a sound of genuine delight mixed with dawning comprehension. "This is even better than I hoped. Hakon Ravenshield, the most feared warrior of his generation, playing farmer while his enemies think him dead. The stories they tell about you in the taverns, my friend, epic tales of impossible victories and legendary skill." "Stories," Hakon said flatly. "Nothing more." "Are they?" Magnus moved closer to the weapons chest, his earlier caution replaced by the fascination of a man who understood exactly what kind of treasure had been revealed. "They say you once killed 30 men in single combat to protect a village from raiders. They say you broke a siege by walking through enemy lines like they were wheat stalks. They say you were the finest warrior alive until you vanished after watching your king fall to treachery. They say many things." Hakon's voice had taken on the flat, emotionless tone of a man discussing the weather. "Most of them are lies told by bards seeking to sell more ale. But not all of them," Runa interjected. "I've seen your hands when you think no one is looking, the way you move when you're startled, the nightmares you have about battles you can't forget." She turned to bladed face Magnus directly, her fear replaced by something that might have been pity. "You want to know what debt I really owed? I owed a debt to the stories my father told me about heroes who protected the innocent. I owed a debt to the belief that somewhere in this world there were still men who chose to be gentle, not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to choose mercy over violence." The revelation hung in the air like incense in a temple, heavy with implications that reached far beyond the simple question of who owed what to whom. Magnus understood now why his usual methods of intimidation had failed to work on Hakon, why the man carried himself with such quiet confidence, why his tactical assessment of village defenses had been so precise. "This changes everything," Magnus said slowly, his mind already working through new possibilities. "Hakon Ravenshield, under my command, could accomplish things that 10 ordinary warriors couldn't manage. We could build an empire together, you and I. I'm not under anyone's command anymore. But think of what we could accomplish. Your legendary skills combined with my organizational capabilities, we could bring order to the entire region, eliminate the petty warlords and bandits that plague these lands. Through conquest and subjugation, through strength and leadership." Magnus's voice took on the passionate intensity of a true believer, explaining his faith. "These people need protection, Hakon. They need guidance. They need someone strong enough to make the hard decisions that lesser men cannot make." Hakon moved to the weapons chest, his fingers trailing along the edge of his old shield without quite touching it. "I made hard decisions for 15 years. I killed men who probably had families waiting for them to come home. I conquered territories and burned villages and told myself it was all in service of a greater good. He looked up at Magnus, and his eyes held the weight of accumulated regret. "Do you know what I learned, Magnus? I learned that the greater good is usually just an excuse for men who enjoy wielding power over others." "You're being naive," Magnus said impatiently. "Power is a tool, nothing more. In the hands of the right man, it can create peace, prosperity, safety for those who cannot protect themselves. And who decides who the right man is? The man strong enough to seize it and wise enough to use it properly." Magnus gestured toward the weapon's chest. "You have the strength, I have the wisdom. Together we could become exactly the kind of men I spent 7 years trying to stop being." Hakon closed the chest with a sound like thunder. "The answer is no, Magnus, to all of it, to your offer of partnership, to your claim on Runa, to your plans for this village. No." Magnus's expression hardened, the mask of reasonable negotiation finally falling away completely. "Then you'll force me to take what I want, instead of accepting what I offered freely. You can try." "Oh, I'll do more than try." Magnus moved toward the door with the confident stride of a man whose backup plans were already in motion. "You see, Hakon Ravenshield, while you've been playing farmer, I've been building something real. I have men waiting in the hills around this village, 20 of them, all experienced warriors who follow my orders without question." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Hakon's tactical mind immediately began calculating odds, escape routes, defensive positions, but the numbers were stark and unforgiving. 20 armed men against 1 rusty warrior and a village full of farmers was not a fight that ended well for the defenders. "You're bluffing," Runa said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Magnus reached into his pack and withdrew a horn carved from black wood. "One blast from this, and my men will know to begin their approach. By dawn, they'll have surrounded the village completely. And then, my dear Hakon, we'll see how long your legendary skills last against overwhelming numbers and innocent lives held hostage." The horn gleamed dully in the lamplight, its surface carved with symbols that spoke of serious military organization. This wasn't the desperate gambit of a man whose plans had been disrupted. It was the reveal of a trap that had been in place from the very beginning. "You've been planning this from the start," Hakon realized. Runa was never the real prize. She was just the excuse you needed to get close to the village, to scout it properly, to position your forces without arousing suspicion. "Very good," Magnus applauded mockingly. "Though I confess, discovering your true identity has exceeded my wildest expectations. Taking Hakon Ravenshield alive will establish my reputation beyond anything I could have accomplished through simple conquest." Runa looked from one man to the other, understanding finally dawning in her eyes. "You knew who he was before you came here. That's why you followed me so far, why you spent so much time and effort tracking down one escaped woman. You weren't hunting me at all." Magnus smiled, and for the first time the expression was entirely genuine. "My dear girl, you were simply the thread that led me to the most valuable prize in the known world, a legendary warrior who everyone believes is dead." The silence that followed Magnus's revelation stretched through the room like a physical presence, heavy with the weight of realization and the approach of inevitable violence. Outside, the peaceful sounds of evening wind through the bare trees, the distant lowing of cattle, settling for the night, seemed to mock the tension building within the modest farmhouse. Magnus held the black horn loosely in his hand, its surface catching the lamplight as he turned it slowly between his fingers. "I want you to understand, Hakon, that this doesn't have to end in bloodshed. My men are disciplined professionals, not wild raiders. If you surrender willingly, if you accept the partnership I'm offering, no one in this village needs to be harmed. And if I refuse, then we'll take what we came for by force, and the villagers will pay the price for your stubbornness." Magnus's tone remained conversational, as if he were discussing crop yields rather than threatening innocent lives. 20 Experienced warriors against farmers, armed with pitchforks and wood-cutting axes. You know how that ends. Hakon moved to the window, gazing out at the village lights, flickering in the distance. In those small, warm glows, he could see the lives he had come to value. Bjorn the elder reading bedtime stories to his grandson, Eric the blacksmith finishing his evening prayers, young mothers tucking children into warm beds, old couples sharing quiet conversations, beside dying fires. 7 years ago, such domestic peace had seemed like an impossible dream. Now it was about to become a nightmare. "How long have you known," he asked without turning around, "about your true identity?" Magnus chuckled softly. "I suspected from the moment I heard about a large, solitary farmer who appeared in Stenlund 7 years ago with coin to buy land, but no history to explain where he'd come from. The timing was perfect, just months after the battle where Hakon Ravenshield supposedly died defending his fallen king. That's hardly proof." "No, but it was enough to justify investigation. I have contacts throughout the region, people who remember things that others prefer to forget. Old soldiers who recalled seeing a man matching your description walking away from that battlefield, wounded but alive. Merchants who remembered selling supplies to a warrior, traveling alone, heading north toward the remote settlements." Magnus moved around the room as he spoke, his movements casual but his attention never wavering from both Hakon and Runa. "The final confirmation came when I spoke with the man who sold Runa to this village. He remembered details about the buyer, not just your size and bearing, but the way you moved, the way you assessed threats, the instinctive positioning that marked you as someone with extensive combat experience." Runa had been listening to this exchange with growing comprehension, pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. "You've been hunting him for years," she said. "I was never anything more than a way to flush him out." "You underestimate yourself, my dear," Magnus replied, with what might have been genuine fondness. "You were quite valuable in your own right. Beautiful, intelligent, possessed of information about various territories I was planning to acquire. But you're correct that your primary value lay in the connection you could provide to your legendary protector." Hakon turned from the window, his face showing none of the turmoil that Magnus's words had stirred within him. "What exactly do you want, Magnus? What's your endgame?" "Empire." The word fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of implication that reached into every corner of their lives. Not the crude barbarism of raiders and petty warlords, but genuine civilization, order imposed by strength, prosperity, protected by overwhelming force, peace maintained through the credible threat of overwhelming violence. Magnus's eyes took on the fervent glow of a man describing his deepest beliefs. "I've studied the great rulers of history, Hakon. Caesar, Alexander, the legendary kings of the ancient world. They understood that true leadership requires both the vision to see what could be and the strength to make it reality. And my role in this grand design? You would be my champion, my enforcer, the visible symbol of the power that backs my authority." Magnus began pacing. Again, his enthusiasm building as he outlined his vision. "Imagine it, Hakon Ravenshield returned from the dead, serving as the ultimate deterrent against any who might challenge the new order. Your reputation alone would prevent a dozen conflicts, save hundreds of lives that would otherwise be lost to pointless resistance." "You're talking about conquest," Hakon said flatly. "I'm talking about unification." Magnus's voice rose with passion. "These lands are fragmented, weak, constantly preyed upon by bandits and raiders because there's no central authority strong enough to protect them. I offer that authority, backed by sufficient force to make it meaningful." Runa had been quietly moving around the room while the men talked, ostensibly clearing the dinner table, but actually positioning herself closer to the weapons chest. "And what happens to people who don't want your protection. What happens to communities that prefer their independence? Magnus's expression hardened slightly. They learn the costs of that preference. You mean they're slaughtered as examples to others? I mean they're educated about reality. Magnus's tone turned cold and practical. Some lessons can only be taught through experience, and some people only learn when the consequences of their choices become unavoidable. Hakon had been studying Magnus throughout this conversation, reading the subtle signs that years of warfare had taught him to recognize. The man's confidence was genuine, backed by careful planning and overwhelming force. But there were also tells the way he unconsciously favored his left side, the slight hesitation when he moved his right arm, the careful way he positioned himself to minimize exposure of what appeared to be an old wound. "You're injured," Hakon observed quietly. Magnus's smile faltered for just a moment. "An old wound from a disagreement with a particularly stubborn village elder. It limits my mobility somewhat, but hardly affects my ability to command. Which is why you need me." Understanding dawned in Hakon's voice. "You're not offering partnership, Magnus. You're admitting weakness. 20 men might be enough to take this village, but they're not enough to hold an empire. For that, you need someone with my skills and reputation." "I need someone who understands the price of peace," Magnus corrected. "Someone who's killed enough men to appreciate the value of preventing unnecessary deaths. And if I refuse, if I'm willing to fight your 20 men rather than serve your ambitions," Magnus lifted the black horn closer to his lips, "then this village burns tonight, and every death that follows is on your conscience. Every child orphaned, every home destroyed, every life lost, all because the great Hakon Ravenshield was too proud to accept a reasonable offer. The threat hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre, heavy with the weight of innocent lives balanced on the edge of a blade." Hakon understood the terrible mathematics of the situation. Even if he somehow managed to defeat Magnus in single combat, 20 armed warriors would still descend on Stenlund like wolves on a sheepfold. The villagers had no defenses, no weapons, no experience with violence beyond the occasional tavern brawl or dispute over property lines. "How long do I have to decide?" Hakon asked. "Until dawn," Magnus replied. "My men have orders to wait for my signal unless they see signs of organized resistance. If you try to arm the villagers, if you attempt to organize any kind of defense, they'll attack immediately." Runa moved closer to Hakon, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of support that felt like an anchor in a storm. "There has to be another way," she said quietly. "Some solution that doesn't end with you sacrificing yourself or the village being destroyed." Hakon looked down at her, seeing not just the woman who had found safety under his roof, but the symbol of everything he had tried to build during his years of peaceful exile. She represented the possibility of redemption, the hope that a man could change his fundamental nature through conscious choice and persistent effort. But Magnus represented something else, the inexorable pull of his original nature, the skills and instincts that had defined him for so much longer than his brief experiment with farming. The black horn in Magnus's hand was more than a signal device. It was a reminder that some problems could only be solved through the application of superior violence. "There might be a way," Hakon said slowly, his mind working through possibilities with the systematic thoroughness of a master tactician. "But it would require perfect timing, considerable risk, and a great deal of luck." "What kind of way?" Magnus asked, his suspicion evident. Hakon smiled for the first time since the conversation began, and the expression transformed his weathered features into something that would have been familiar to any warrior who had fought beside the legendary Ravenshield. The kind that reminds everyone why some legends refuse to stay dead. He moved to the weapons chest, his worn leather gloves flexing as he reached for the handles. "Tell me, Magnus, when you planned this elaborate trap, did you stop to consider what might happen if the mouse you were hunting turned out to still have teeth?" Magnus raised the horn toward his lips, but hesitated as something in Hakon's tone gave him pause. You're outnumbered 20-1, and you have innocent lives to protect. There's no scenario where direct confrontation serves your interests. You're right, Hakon agreed as he lifted his old shield from the chest, its raven and hammer design seeming to pulse with remembered glory. There's no scenario where direct confrontation serves my interests. Fortunately for me, I've never been much good at direct confrontation. The leather wrapping around his sword came away, like old skin being shed, revealing steel that gleamed despite its years of storage. As Hakon's fingers closed around the familiar grip, something fundamental shifted in his posture, his bearing, his entire presence. The peaceful farmer was gone, burned away like morning mist before the rising sun. In his place stood something far older and infinitely more dangerous, a predator who had spent 7 years learning patience but had never forgotten how to hunt. The transformation was subtle, at first a shift in posture, a change in the way Hakon held his shoulders, the emergence of a predatory stillness that made the air in the room feel suddenly heavy and dangerous. Magnus watched with growing unease as the man he had cornered began to shed his carefully maintained disguise like a snake shedding its skin. "You know what I learned during 15 years of warfare?" Hakon asked, conversationally, as he tested the balance of his sword with practiced movements. "I learned that the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who charges headfirst into battle. It's the one who lets you think you have him trapped while he counts your weaknesses." Magnus kept the horn raised, but didn't blow it yet, his tactical mind recognizing that something had fundamentally changed in the dynamic between them. "Clever words won't change the mathematics of the situation, Hakon. 20 men, dawn deadline, innocent lives at stake. 20 men scattered through the hills around a village." "They've never properly scouted," Hakon corrected, his worn leather gloves now gripping the sword with deadly familiarity. 20 men who think they're hunting a retired farmer instead of someone who spent years perfecting the art of making superior numbers irrelevant. Runa pressed herself against the wall, watching the exchange with fascination and growing hope. This wasn't the gentle man who had offered her safety and asked nothing in return. This was something altogether more primal and infinitely more capable. "You're still outnumbered," Magnus insisted, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Am I?" Hakon moved to the window again, but this time his gaze wasn't focused on the village lights. Instead, he was studying the landscape with the calculating eyes of someone mapping a battlefield. "Tell me, Magnus, what do you see when you look out there?" Magnus joined him at the window, following his gaze across the moonlit farmland. "I see open ground, defensible positions, and clear lines of approach that my men can use to surround the village." "Interesting," Hakon nodded thoughtfully. "I see the old oak grove where your eastern sentries are, posted the one where dry leaves will crackle underfoot and give away any movement. I see the rocky outcrop where you've positioned your archers, excellent visibility, but only one way down that doesn't involve a fatal fall. I see the stream bed that your western flank is using for concealment, the one that floods quickly when the beaver dam upriver gets blocked." Magnus stared at him in growing alarm. "You've been watching us." "I've been watching everything," Hakon replied. 7 years of farming teaches a man to observe his environment very carefully. Weather patterns, animal movements, seasonal changes, and the subtle signs that indicate when that environment has been disturbed by uninvited guests. The revelation hit Magnus like a physical blow. His carefully positioned forces, his tactical advantages, his overwhelming numbers, all of it had been observed and analyzed by someone with far more experience in this kind of warfare than he possessed. "When did you first know?" Magnus asked. 3 days ago, when my chickens started laying fewer eggs," Hakon said matter-of-factly. "Chickens are sensitive to predators in the area, even human ones. When their routine changes, something is disturbing their territory." Runa found herself smiling despite the danger. Even in revealing his deadly capabilities, Hakon couldn't resist sharing the gentle wisdom he'd gained from farming life. Then yesterday, Hakon continued, when the morning fog patterns shifted slightly near the old oak grove. Fog moves differently around warm bodies, especially when those bodies are trying to remain motionless for extended periods. Magnus was no longer even pretending to threaten with the horn. His entire strategic framework was collapsing as he realized his opponent had been playing a completely different game from the beginning. And this morning, Hakon finished, when Thunder, my old draft horse, kept looking toward the rocky outcrop and snorting. Horses have excellent distance vision and can spot movement that humans miss. Entirely. So what's your plan? Magnus asked, his voice tight with the strain of trying to regain control of a situation that had slipped completely away from him. Hakon set down his sword and reached for a simple oil lamp from the table. My plan is to remind your 20 men why some legends are worth remembering. He moved toward the door, his movements now carrying the fluid grace of a master predator preparing to hunt. And to show you the difference between commanding frightened farmers and trying to trap someone who spent years learning patience, if you leave this house, I blow the horn, and the attack begins immediately. No, Hakon said with quiet certainty. You don't. Why not? Hakon paused at the door, looking back at Magnus with something that might have been pity. Because you're finally beginning to understand that you never had me trapped at all. You walked into my territory, threatened my people, and assumed that 7 years of peaceful living had made me weak. He smiled, and the expression was cold as winter iron. The horn stays silent because you're starting to realize that your men might be the ones who need protecting. With that, Hakon, Ravenshield stepped out into the night, and the legend began to remember why it had never truly died. The night air carried the scent of approaching winter and the subtle sounds of men who thought they were hidden. Hakon moved through his familiar territory with the ghostly silence that had earned him his battlefield nickname, each step placed with the precision of someone who knew exactly where every twig and stone lay, waiting to betray an unwary foot. Inside the farmhouse, Magnus and Runa waited in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what was unfolding beyond the walls. Magnus gripped the black horn with white knuckles, torn between the tactical necessity of summoning his forces and the growing certainty that doing so might trigger a catastrophe he wasn't prepared to handle. He's going to get himself killed, Magnus muttered, more to himself than to Runa. 20 against 1, no matter how skilled, no matter how legendary, the mathematics don't lie. Runa clutched the bundle of heather against her chest, its dried flowers now seeming less like remnants of the past and more like talismans of hope for the future. You don't understand him, she said, quietly. 7 years ago, maybe those numbers would have mattered, but 7 years of farming taught him patience, taught him to think beyond the immediate problem to long-term solutions. Farming, Magnus laughed bitterly. You think farming is useful preparation for warfare? I think learning to nurture life teaches you things that taking life never could. Runa moved to the window, peering out into the darkness where her protector had vanished. Hakon understands this land, these people, the rhythms and patterns that outsiders miss. Your men are skilled warriors, but they're strangers here. He's home. The first sign that something had gone wrong for Magnus's forces came as a distant shout from the direction of the old oak grove, quickly cut short. Magnus stiffened, raising the horn toward his lips, but the silence that followed was somehow more ominous than continued. Fighting would have been. What was that? He demanded. That, Runa said with growing confidence, was your eastern sentries discovering why dry leaves make poor concealment for men who don't understand the local wildlife patterns. Magnus stared at her in alarm. What do you mean? Hakon keeps beehives near that grove. The bees are dormant now, but they've left scent trails that the local animals follow. Any experienced woodsman would know that deer avoid those paths after sunset, but strangers wouldn't think to check for such details. Another sound reached them from a different Direction, the unmistakable splash of someone falling into water, followed by muffled curses and the clatter of equipment being hastily retrieved from a streambed. "The Beaver Dam," Runa continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone providing educational commentary. "Hakon mentioned it yesterday morning when he was checking the water levels. The beavers have been more active lately, and their dams create unpredictable flooding in areas that look perfectly safe during daylight hours." Magnus was now pacing frantically, the horn forgotten in his growing agitation. "This is impossible. These are experienced warriors, men who fought in multiple campaigns." "Experienced at fighting other warriors," Runa agreed. "But how much experience do they have fighting farmers who understand every rock, every tree, every seasonal pattern in their own territory?" From the rocky outcrop came the sound of stones cascading down the hillside, accompanied by increasingly creative profanity in multiple languages. Magnus's supposed tactical advantage was dissolving into chaos as his carefully positioned forces discovered that their concealment wasn't concealing them from anyone. "Who knew what to look for?" "Your archers," Runa observed, "seem to be having difficulty with the local geology." The truth was even worse than Magnus could have imagined. His men weren't being defeated in glorious battle, they were being systematically confused, disoriented, and demoralized by someone who turned their own concealment against them. In the oak grove, warriors found themselves stumbling through underbrush that seemed determined to entangle their weapons and equipment. At the streambed, supposedly dry ground proved to be treacherous mud that sucked at boots and made silent movement impossible. On the rocky outcrop, loose stones that had looked perfectly stable in daylight revealed themselves to be precariously balanced traps waiting for the unwary. "He's not fighting them," Magnus realized with dawning horror. "He's herding them." Toward what? The answer came as a distant roar, the unmistakable sound of the Beaver Dam giving way under carefully applied pressure, sending a wall of water rushing down the streambed toward the village. But the flood's path had been diverted by strategically placed stones and fallen logs, channeling it away from Stenlund and directly toward the low ground where Magnus's remaining forces had taken refuge. "The old quarry," Runa said with something approaching admiration. "Hakon mentioned it when we were discussing drainage patterns for the winter rains. It fills quickly when the stream floods, and the banks are too steep for easy climbing." Magnus finally raised the horn to his lips and blew a long, desperate blast that echoed across the moonlit landscape. But the response that came back wasn't the organized advance of 20 disciplined warriors. It was the scattered calls of men who were cold, wet, confused, and increasingly convinced that they were dealing with something far beyond their experience or preparation. "Legends," Runa said softly, watching Magnus's confidence crumble like poorly mortared stone, "survive because they adapt." Dawn broke over Stenlund with the kind of crystalline clarity that follows a night of revelation, painting the frost-covered fields in shades of gold and silver that seemed to promise new beginnings. Hakon returned to his farmhouse as the first rays of sunlight touched the village rooftops, his worn leather gloves damp with morning dew, and his expression carrying the quiet satisfaction of a job completed with professional competence. Magnus sat slumped at the kitchen table where they had shared dinner less than 12 hours earlier, the black horn lying forgotten beside his elbow. His 20 experienced warriors had been reduced to a soggy, demoralized collection of men who were currently making their way back to their horses with the shameful haste of soldiers retreating from a battlefield they had never actually reached. "Your forces seem to be departing," Hakon observed mildly as he hung his sword back in its place within the weapons chest. "I trust their withdrawal won't cause any difficulties for local wildlife." Magnus looked up with eyes that held the hollow expression of a man whose certainties had been systematically demolished. "How many did you kill?" "None." Hakon moved to the fire, adding wood to restore. the warmth that had been lost during their long, cold night of waiting. Killing them would have required explaining 20 bodies to the village elders, and I've grown to appreciate a quiet life. But they're defeated. They're educated, Hakon corrected gently. There's a difference. Dead men can't spread the word that Stenlund is under the protection of someone they don't want to challenge again. Live men with wounded pride and soggy equipment, on the other hand, make excellent messengers. Runa emerged from the corner where she had spent the long night hours, still clutching the bundle of heather, but now holding it like a cherished keepsake rather than a desperate anchor. The morning light revealed the changes that the night's events had wrought. In her expression gone was the haunted wariness that had shadowed her features since her arrival, replaced by something that looked remarkably like peace. "What happens now?" she asked. Magnus stirred himself enough to attempt one last negotiation. "My offer still stands, Hakon. Partnership, shared authority, the chance to build something lasting and significant. Last night proved you still possess all your legendary capabilities. Imagine what we could accomplish working together." Hakon pulled on his worn leather gloves with the same deliberate care he had shown every morning for 7 years, the familiar gesture now carrying the weight of conscious choice rather than simple routine. "I've spent enough years building things through conquest, Magnus. I prefer construction that doesn't require foundations made of other people's bones." "And what exactly have you constructed here?" Magnus gestured around the modest farmhouse with its simple furnishings and humble comforts. "What great achievement can you deditions point to after 7 years of exile?" Hakon looked at Runa, seeing in her transformed expression the answer to Magnus's question. "I helped someone remember that they were worthy of safety. I learned that strength can be measured in gentleness rather than body counts. I discovered that the most important victories are often the ones that no bard will ever sing about." He moved to the window, gazing out at the village that was beginning to stir with the activities of another ordinary day. Smoke rising from chimneys as families prepared breakfast, children running between houses with the boundless energy of youth, neighbors greeting each other with the comfortable familiarity of people who had chosen to build lives together rather than simply survive in proximity to one another. "This is what I've constructed, Magnus, a place where people can tend their gardens and raise their children, and grow old together without constantly looking over their shoulders for the next threat, the next conqueror, the next man who thinks his strength gives him the right to determine their fate." Magnus rose from the table with the stiff movements of a man whose body was finally acknowledging the defeats his mind had been denying. "You're making a mistake, Hakon. Men like us aren't meant for peaceful lives. The violence will call to you again, and when it does, you'll remember what you've given up." "Perhaps," Hakon acknowledged, "but if that day comes, I'll face it as the man I've chosen to become, not as the man I used to be." Magnus gathered his belongings with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing familiar actions, while his thoughts remained elsewhere. As he moved toward the door, he paused to look back at Runa, his expression holding a mixture of regret and something that might have been genuine affection. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for the debt that was never real, for the years of fear I caused you, for using you as bait to hunt a legend. You deserved better." Runa nodded, accepting the apology without forgiveness, but also without bitterness. "We all deserve better, Magnus. The difference is that some of us are willing to do the work of creating it." After Magnus departed, riding alone toward a horizon that no longer held the promise of easy conquest, Hakon and Runa stood together in the doorway of their home, watching the village come alive with the rhythms of another day. "The bundle of heather," Hakon said, noticing that she still held the dried flowers. "Will you keep it?" Runa looked down at the brittle stems and faded petals, considering the question with the gravity it deserved. "I think so," she said. "Finally, not as a reminder of what I lost, but as a symbol of what can survive, even when everything else seems to be dying." She moved to the table and carefully placed the bundle in its clay pot, arranging it so that morning light could reach the delicate flowers. Besides, spring comes. Eventually, maybe it's time to plant new seeds. Hakon pulled off his worn leather gloves and set them beside the heather, the two artifacts of their shared journey now resting side by side in the growing warmth of the morning sun. Outside, the village of Stenlund continued its peaceful existence, protected not by walls or weapons, but by the simple revolutionary act of people choosing to care for one another without condition or price. And in the modest farmhouse on the village's eastern edge, two people who had been broken by the world's cruelty began the quiet work of healing together, tending gardens of hope in soil that had been watered by kindness and would bloom with the patient persistence of love freely given.